So just to remind you of where we are and sort of what we've gotten done. So we talked about a lot about blood and the different types of cells that are in our blood and things like that. And we moved on, we started talking about the actual heart and heart anatomy, the valves and so forth. We talked a little bit about some circulation. And so what we're going to finish up with are a couple things. We're going to talk about types of blood vessels, their characteristics, their functions. We'll talk about some cardiovascular disease. And we'll talk a little bit here about the lymphatic system, because it's also involved in the transport of material in living things. So let's start with blood vessels. So there's really three broad categories of blood vessels. There's arteries, veins, and capillaries. We'll talk about each one in turn. So arteries, they carry blood where? Away from the heart. So the arteries carry blood away from the heart. If you ever have trouble remembering, the A in artery goes to the way. So the arteries lead away from the heart, carry blood to various locations in the body. Obviously, all parts of our body need a supply of blood, so it's the arteries that carry that blood away from the heart and to those various places. Now, usually they carry what? Oxygenated. Typically oxygenated. The exception is in the pulmonary artery. And the pulmonary artery carries deoxygenated blood because that blood is destined for where? Lungs. To the lungs. It's going to be going to the lungs, so on its way there, it's deoxygenated. Yep.
Why do we have to feel arteries when we feel our pulse?
We'll talk about that. Well, let's talk about that here. So, where are they, first of all? So, arteries carry the blood away from our heart, and so typically, if you look at sort of the back of your hand or something, or where you can see blood vessels, are you looking at arteries? No, those are mostly veins. Because why aren't you seeing arteries? They're deeper in your body. Generally, they're deeper in your body. Not always, but usually. Because they sort of need to be a little bit more protected. Because when your heart pumps blood into your circulatory system, the pressure in the arteries is quite high. So arteries have much higher blood pressure than veins. And so that's why we feel, because our arteries swell each time, that's down here, each time our heart forces a large volume of blood into our arteries. These arteries swell up slightly. And where in areas of our body where they're somewhat close to the surface, we can feel that swelling, and that's what we feel when we feel our pulse. We're feeling blood rushing into those arteries. Now, by the time that blood makes its way and is returning to the heart and veins, the pressure is much lower. Okay? And so we don't feel that, the pulse in our veins, because they're not moving as much. There's not as much swelling. And so part of this has to do with the composition of our arteries. So arteries are elastic. They're quite flexible. Okay? They're strong because, again, they have to withstand that pressure in them. And they're smooth on the inside to allow blood to flow efficiently through them. They're pretty thick if we're comparing them to veins. And so they're made of smooth muscle. They're elastic, but they're strong. And so we can feel our arteries, and you can feel your carotid artery in your neck. Okay, you can feel some arteries in your wrists. Those are areas where they're closer to the surface, where you can actually feel the movement of those arteries. Several types of cardiovascular. We'll talk more about cardiovascular disease sort of later on, but several types of cardiovascular disease affect the arteries. An aneurysm, you probably have heard of, is a swelling of an artery. So you see here we have a normal artery, and a sort of bulge in that is an aneurysm, and it's an area of weakness. Okay, and you know, with high blood pressure or with the buildup of other plaques and so forth, they can actually burst, those aneurysms. And if they burst, then obviously you lose blood flow to a certain part of the body, and you have the accumulation of blood in a certain area, and so that's something that could be dangerous. Aneurysm. You can have the buildup of plaques and cholesterol and fatty substances inside of arteries, which narrows them and makes it more difficult for blood to flow through. We'll talk about some more of those later on. So when we talk about circulation, are all these in your notes, or are these? No. Okay. So when we talk about circulation, just do this in turn as I talk about it so you can listen as well. So we have our pulmonary we have different sort of types of circulation, different circuits that blood follows in our body. So one of those important areas is our pulmonary circulation. This is a circulation from our heart to where? The lungs and back. Okay, that circuit is called pulmonary circulation. It's the flow of blood from the heart to and from the lungs. And obviously that's important. Our blood needs to get rid of its waste products of carbon dioxide in our lungs. It needs to take in new oxygen to deliver to cells. So that pulmonary circulation is very important. Then sort of the rest of circulation comes under this blanket term of systemic circulation. That's the flow of blood to all the other parts of our body. But within that, there are subcategories. Okay? So coronary circulation is obviously the circulation that supplies our blood, our heart with blood. You would think like, well, your heart is filled with blood, so it doesn't need its own circulation. But actually, your heart muscle itself is not getting oxygen and nutrients from the blood within it. It actually has a separate set of arteries that go on the outside of the heart, the coronary arteries, which actually supply the heart muscle itself with blood. Renal circulation. Okay? Renal means having to do with the kidneys. And as our aorta, so if we look at this for a minute, as blood leaves our heart through the left ventricle, goes through our aorta, and then the aorta actually loops behind the heart. Here it's shown sort of off to the side, but it loops behind the heart and starts bringing blood lower in the body. Okay, it's called the descending aorta, or the abdominal aorta. Okay, you can see it here. So the heart's not shown in this diagram, but it would be up here. And that blood goes down this aorta, and along the way, about 20% of the blood goes to the kidneys. And again, we didn't talk about them yet, but we know the kidneys filter our blood, take out substances that could be toxic if they built up. So renal circulation is that circulation to the kidneys. Portal circulation is that circulation. We remember when we talked about the digestive system and nutrition, that most of the blood from the intestine goes through the liver before it goes back into the heart again. That circulation is called portal circulation. There's also circulation then from the liver, where that blood again is further filtered into the heart, to the vena cava, is called the hepatic vein that brings that blood back. And you can see these are shown here. The hepatic vein brings the blood from the liver back to the heart. So those are sort of different subsets of our circulation that happens in our bodies. If you look closely, here's a diagram that shows major arteries of the body. If you look here, so this is the aorta. So this would be connected to what? What would be here?
The heart.
The heart. Okay. This is blood leaving the left ventricle. It's pumped through the aorta. So the aorta has a couple parts. It has the ascending aorta, which goes up, and then it loops around. That's called the arch, the aortic arch. And then as that aorta loops down behind the heart, that's the descending aorta, which eventually is called the abdominal aorta once it's down in the abdomen. Okay, so along the way, this is obviously major blood vessel, major artery, carries the majority of blood leaving the heart. And so branching off of this aorta our other arteries to bring blood to different places. One of the first branches off of the aorta are the coronary arteries. These are the arteries that are going to supply the heart itself with blood. Extremely important arteries. As blood continues up, you have some branches that go, so this branch, this first branch off of the aorta, the brachiocephalic artery, this branch turns into subclavian artery, goes down the right arm. The right carotid artery goes up into the head and the right side. Over here, the left carotid artery, again, brings blood up into the head. That supplies blood to your brain and your face and all the other parts. The left subclavian artery goes down the left arm. So these branches are supplying blood for basically your upper body. Then, as that aorta descends and goes down into the abdomen, then those other branches supply the abdomen, and then there's major arteries, the femoral arteries, that one each goes down each leg to supply the rest of the body. So that's sort of what our circulation looks like. If we compare then arteries to veins, there are some important differences. Veins, first of all, we know the direction of flow is back towards the heart. Generally, they carry, Nate? Oh yeah, you're out of order. I switched things up, but so yeah, we'll come back to that slide. I probably should have left it now that I think about it, but anyway. What type of blood do veins carry typically? Except for?
The pulmonary vein.
Except for the pulmonary vein, because that's carrying blood from the lungs back to the heart. Veins, many of them are more on the surface, close to our skin. There's some deeper veins, though, that carry blood from within our body. So when you look at sort of your hands or stuff, I have really veiny hands. You can see your veins, various parts of your body. And veins are not as thick-walled. They're thinner. They're also made of smooth muscle tissue. But inside of them, they also have valves, which are important. You could see in this diagram or this diagram, these sort of one-way valves that are in the veins. And those valves are important because, as we said, the pressure in veins is what compared to arteries?
Low.
Much lower. And so there's not that pressure forcing blood back to the heart. And so every time when the heart relaxes, there's a possibility that that blood would then go back in the veins because there's not that pressure forcing it forward. And so these valves prevent the backflow of blood. Okay? So that when blood goes through one of these valves, okay, it can't go back. So as it moves through our body, these veins prevent backflow. There are times when these valves break down and don't function properly. If you ever heard of varicose veins are small veins where the valves have collapsed. And so if you look at this example, that as blood is going up the legs, okay, this valve, it goes up, and this valve prevents it from going backwards. If this valve is not functioning and not closing correctly, this blood can flow backwards, and blood tends to pool in those areas. Those veins become extended and swollen. And a lot of times you can see it happens a lot of times in people as they get older, they develop these varicose veins as these valves break down. You can see them as sort of bulging veins. You often see them in lower extremities because that's where the blood pools, in the legs and the feet and so forth. And they sort of swell up. People can have them removed sometimes if they're causing a problem. But that's what those are. Again, if we look at our system of veins, very similar to our arteries. They're not the same, obviously, but everywhere blood goes to, it eventually needs to come back from. So they sort of mirror each other, and you can see some of our major veins, the jugular veins in your neck that brings the blood down from your brain and your face, and the veins, the subclavian veins that bring it up from your arms, the iliac veins which bring that up through from our legs, through our hips, into eventually all of these various veins reconnect with the vena cava, the inferior vena cava, okay, which brings the blood up from the lower parts of the body, and the superior vena cava, which brings it from the upper parts of the body. And then we have the capillaries, so the arteries, veins, connecting the two. They're all connected to each other. And its capillaries are that intermediary. When arteries leave, obviously the aorta is very big, very wide. But as it branches off, just like the branch on a tree, each time it branches, it gets smaller and smaller and smaller, until eventually it's very small, tiny little, we call them arterioles, that's a tiny little artery. And they branch until they're so small that they form what we call capillaries. And the capillaries, they connect their arteries to the veins. And this is the site of exchange of material. So carbon dioxide, oxygen, glucose, amino acids, fatty acids, nitrogen waste, all the things that move from our body tissues, our body cells, into and out of our blood, this happens in the capillaries. Basically, all of our body tissue is surrounded by this very thin network of capillaries. That's why if you get a cut anywhere on your body, even if there's not like an obvious vein, you bleed because there are capillaries. You may not see them, they're microscopic, they're very, very thin, they're about 1 cell thick. Blood cells have to go through them individually, basically single file. So they're very, very small. They carry oxygenated blood or deoxygenated blood. You know, if we're talking about a capillary that's leads to your muscle, the blood going into the capillary is oxygenated. After that blood has gone through the capillary, it's then deoxygenated. And those capillaries start reconnecting, merging together to form veins. Venules are the tiny ones. Those venules combine to form veins and eventually lead back to the heart. So they're all interconnected. So they surround all of our tissue, all of our body, surrounded by this capillary network, we call it. Very, very thin, single cell thick. We damage capillaries and rupture them internally. That's what leads to bruising.
Why is bruising like blue or like sometimes?
As those blood cells, yeah, I mean the blue is from that damaged blood that's inside of your body. As it starts to break down, the color of it changes, and as you know those blood cells are sort of taken away and recycled, then the bluish color goes away. Sometimes people that are diabetic, if their blood glucose is not managed properly, excess glucose in the blood can damage capillaries, okay? And that can lead to various types of problems in terms of things like vision problems or necrosis, the death of tissue that's not getting adequate supply of oxygen. Those things can happen if blood glucose levels are not managed properly. And again, here we see as these red blood cells are going through, as the blood's going through this tiny capillary, it's moving single file, oxygen, nutrients are diffusing from the blood into the body tissue. At the same time, waste products are diffusing into the blood to be carried away. And so the blood leading in is coming from an artery, the blood leaving is a vein. And this shows basically the same sort of thing. If we look here, another view of it. Again, this is an artery coming in. It's a vein leaving. In between is a capillary. Okay. This network of capillaries surrounds, these are just body cells, cells of our tissue. They could be anywhere. So what's surrounding these cells?
Tissue fluid.
Yeah, what do we call that? We call it one thing when it's in the blood. We call it something else when it gets forced out of the capillaries.
Oh, it's lit.
Okay, what's it called in the blood?
Plasma.
Plasma. In the capillaries, some of that plasma gets forced out, and then it's called lymph. What was it? The other term we use for lymph? 3-letter abbreviation? ICF? We never talked about ICF? Intercellular? No. Fluid. But anyway, its fluid gets forced out. That's one of the reasons that the pressure drops because that fluid gets forced out, there's a lower volume, okay? And that then surrounds, so when oxygen diffuses out of these blood cells, it diffuses into the plasma, into the lymph, which then allows it to diffuse into these body cells. That lymph then makes its way into the lymphatic system to be redistributed.
What does the lymphatic system do again?
We're going to talk about that in the at the end of this, but it basically just redistributes this lymph that got forced out of our blood, redistributes it and gets it back into our blood supply to reconstitute the plasma. All right. Yeah, let's hold off on heart disease and the lymphatic system until tomorrow, and then we'll finish up.
So the quiz on everything you just did plus stuff in it.
Yeah.